The sound of glass shattering against the wall sent Josephine Mercer ducking behind the kitchen counter, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her apron. Golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of their modest home in Breckenridge, Colorado, casting deceptively peaceful shadows across the pine floor, a stark contrast to the violence unfolding within. "I told you to watch your portions," growled Edgar Mercer, her husband of 3 years, as he advanced toward her with his face contorted in rage. "Look at you getting fat and lazy while I work myself to the bone at the mine." Josephine's eyes darted to the half-eaten biscuit on her plate, the cause of his current fury. At 24, she had once been vibrant and hopeful, but 3 years of marriage to Edgar had hollowed her out like drought-stricken earth. Her auburn hair, once lustrous, now hung limply around her gaunt face. "I'm sorry, Edgar," she whispered, hating the quiver in her voice. "I was just so hungry after cleaning all day." His hand shot out, striking her across the face with such force that she stumbled backward. "Hungry? You're always hungry. What do you think I am, made of money? Every penny I make and you just want to stuff your face." The irony was that Josephine was thin, too thin. Edgar controlled everything, including what and when she ate. Some days he decided she didn't deserve a full meal at all. Today had been one of those days, until hunger had driven her to take an extra biscuit from the pantry. "Please, Edgar," she begged, raising her hands to shield herself as he grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. The front door suddenly burst open. "Mercer, your foreman's looking for you." The deep voice fell silent as the man in the doorway took in the scene before him. Darius Vance stood framed in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. At 32, he was one of the most respected cowboys in Breckenridge, working as a trail guide for the mining companies and occasionally helping with cattle drives from the surrounding ranches. His dark hair fell in waves beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes, usually warm and friendly, had gone cold as ice. Edgar released Josephine's arm, straightening his shirt. "Vance, heard of knocking?" Darius's gaze moved from Edgar to Josephine, noting the fresh mark blooming on her cheek and the fear in her amber eyes. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained eerily calm. "Mrs. Mercer, pack your things." Edgar laughed, an ugly sound. "Excuse me, I wasn't talking to you." Darius's hand moved to rest on the handle of his revolver, not drawing it, just making his presence known. "Madam, I suggest you gather whatever you need. You won't be staying here tonight." Josephine stared at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. Edgar stepped forward, his face reddening. "Now you listen here, cowboy. That's my wife. That's a woman you're beating." Darius cut him off, his voice dropping dangerously. "And I don't abide men who beat women, especially not over food." His eyes flickered to the meager portion on Josephine's plate. "This is none of your business, Vance. I'm making it my business." Darius turned to Josephine again. "Madam, your things." Josephine hesitated, years of fear and Edgar's control making her freeze. "Leave, just like that." Where would she go? What would she do? Edgar lunged at Darius, but the cowboy was quicker. With one fluid movement, he sidestepped Edgar's attack and delivered a sharp blow to his stomach that sent him doubling over. "Mrs. Mercer," Darius said firmly, keeping his eyes on Edgar, "I won't ask again." Something in his tone, not threatening, but determined, broke through her paralysis. Josephine nodded and hurried to the bedroom, heart pounding as she grabbed the small carpet bag from beneath the bed. She threw in her spare dress, nightgown, hairbrush, and the tiny photograph of her parents. Her hands shook so badly she could barely close the clasp. When she returned to the main room, Edgar was sitting in a chair, held there by Darius's unwavering stare, and the revolver now drawn and pointed at the floor, a clear warning. "She's not going anywhere with you," Edgar snarled. "That's her choice." Darius looked to Josephine. "Madam." Josephine clutched her bag to her chest, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay years of pain and fear. Before her, uncertainty, but also the first glimpse of freedom she'd had since saying "I do" to a man who'd shown his true colors only after the preacher had spoken the final blessing. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'll go with you, Mr. Vance." Darius nodded, never taking his eyes off Edgar. "Walk out first, Mrs. Mercer. I'll be right behind you." As Josephine stepped past her husband, he grabbed her wrist. "You walk out that door, don't you ever think about coming back." She looked into the eyes of the man who had once promised to cherish her, now filled with nothing but hatred and rage. "I won't," she said simply, pulling free of his grasp. The cool September air hit her face as she stepped outside, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and freedom. She heard Darius's boots on the porch behind her and the click of the door as it closed. "My horse is hitched over by the general store," he said, his voice gentle now. "Can you walk that far?" Josephine nodded, clutching her bag tighter. "Where are you taking me, Mrs.?" "Sullivan runs a boarding house on Pine Street. She's a good woman. She'll give you a place to stay until you figure things out." He kept a respectful distance as they walked, but Josephine noticed how he positioned himself between her and the road, as if shielding her from view. "Why?" she asked after they'd walked a few minutes in silence. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Darius's expression darkened. "My mother lived with a man like your husband for 15 years. By the time she found the courage to leave, she was so broken inside that she never really recovered." He looked at her, his green eyes intense. "No one helped her. I swore I'd never stand by if I saw the same happening to someone else." They reached his horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding that nickered softly as Darius approached. He secured her bag, then helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode through town, Josephine felt as though every eye was upon them, judging, wondering. She held herself rigidly, trying not to lean back against Darius's solid chest despite the security it promised. "They'll talk," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Let them," he replied, his breath warming her ear. "Better they talk than you suffer another day under that roof." The boarding house came into view, a large 2-story structure with a welcoming front porch. As Darius helped her dismount, Josephine felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. When was the last time she'd eaten more than a few bites? She swayed, and his strong hand steadied her. "You're not well," he observed, concern etching lines around his eyes. "I'm fine. Just tired." He didn't believe her that much was clear, but he didn't press. Instead, he guided her up the steps to the door, which opened before they could knock to reveal a stout woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "Darius Vance, what brings you?" The woman stopped, her gaze taking in Josephine's bruised face and trembling form. Understanding dawned immediately. "Come in, dear. Come in right away." "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Mrs. Mercer," Darius said. "She needs a room and perhaps a good meal." Mrs. Sullivan nodded, ushering them inside. "Of course. I've got a room just opened up yesterday, nice view of the mountains." She took Josephine's arm gently. "Let's get you settled, dear." Josephine turned to Darius, suddenly afraid to let this stranger who had become her unlikely savior walk away. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." His expression softened. "No need for repayment, Mrs. Mercer. Just take care of yourself." He tipped his hat. "I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right." She nodded, surprised at how much she wanted that. As Mrs. Sullivan led her upstairs, Josephine felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. hope. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that indeed offered a stunning view of the mountains rising behind Breckenridge. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, her bag beside her, feeling strangely untethered. "Now then, Mrs. Sullivan said, her hands on her ample hips, "let's see about that face of yours." She disappeared and returned moments later with a damp cloth and a jar of salve. As she gently dabbed at Josephine's cheek, her eyes were filled not with pity, but with understanding. "Edgar Mercer," she said, shaking her head. "I've heard whispers, should have known they were true." Josephine looked down at her hands. "I should have left sooner." "Don't you start that now," Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. "Leaving takes courage, and courage takes time to build. You're here now, that's what matters." She finished with the salve and stepped back. "Now, when did you last eat a proper meal?" Josephine hesitated. "I don't remember." Mrs. Sullivan's mouth set in a grim line. "Well, that won't do. I've got stew simmering downstairs. You rest a bit and I'll bring you up a bowl." When Mrs. Sullivan returned with not only stew but fresh bread and apple pie, Josephine nearly wept. The older woman watched as she ate, slowly at first, then with increasing hunger. "Mr. Vance," Josephine said between bites. "How do you know him?" Mrs. Sullivan smiled. "Everyone knows Darius Vance. Best trail guide in the county and one of the few men around these parts who's exactly what he seems. Lost his father young, raised by his mother until she passed 5 years back. He's guided mining expeditions, cattle drives, even helped the sheriff track outlaws a time or two." She refilled Josephine's water glass. "But mostly, he's known for having a good heart. Takes after his mother that way." Josephine thought of the determined set of his jaw as he'd confronted Edgar, the gentleness in his hands as he'd helped her onto his horse. "He said he'd check on me tomorrow." "And he will," Mrs. Sullivan assured her. "Darius Vance is a man of his word." That night, lying in a strange bed in a strange room, Josephine stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with the enormity of what had happened. She had left Edgar. After 3 years of enduring his cruelty, of believing she had no choice, no way out, she had walked away. Because a cowboy she barely knew had given her the chance. Sleep came eventually, and with it, the first peaceful night she'd had in years. Morning brought sunlight streaming through her window, and the scent of coffee from downstairs. Josephine rose, washed her face carefully around the bruise, and changed into her spare dress. It hung loose on her frame, evidence of Edgar's strict control over her diet. In the boarding house dining room, several other lodgers were already eating breakfast. They glanced at her curiously but politely, and Mrs. Sullivan introduced her simply as Mrs. Mercer, our newest guest. Josephine was halfway through a plate of eggs and bacon when a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Sullivan returned moments later with Darius Vance, his hat in his hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "I hope you slept well." She felt a flush creep into her cheeks at the attention from the other boarders. "I did, thank you, Mr. Vance." Mrs. Sullivan gestured to an empty chair at Josephine's table. "Sit down, Darius. Have you eaten?" "I have, thank you, madam." But he did take the seat, setting his hat on the table beside him. Up close in the morning light, Josephine could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the tiny scar that ran along his jawline. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Better," she admitted. "Mrs. Sullivan has been very kind. She's good that way." He leaned forward slightly. "I spoke with Sheriff Davis this morning, told him what I saw." Fear clutched at Josephine's heart. "What did he say?" "He said Edgar Mercer's been trouble since he arrived in town 2 years ago. Bar fights, gambling debts. He wasn't surprised." Darius's expression grew serious. "The sheriff wanted me to ask if you'd like to press charges." Josephine set down her fork, appetite suddenly gone. Press charges. The thought of facing Edgar across a courtroom, of having to detail his abuses to strangers. She shook her head. "I just want to move forward," she whispered. Darius nodded, no judgment in his eyes. "I understand, but the sheriff did say he'd keep an eye on Edgar, make sure he doesn't bother you." Relief washed through her. "Thank you." "There's something else," Darius continued. "Mrs. Peterson at the dressmaker's shop is looking for help. I mentioned your situation, hope you don't mind, and she said you could come by today if you're interested." Josephine stared at him, overwhelmed. You found me work," he shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Just passing along information. Whether you take it or not is entirely up to you." For the first time in years, Josephine had a choice about her own future. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'll go this afternoon," she decided. "I'm handy with a needle, at least I used to be before Edgar," Darius finished when she faltered. She nodded, looking down at her plate. "Mrs. Mercer." He hesitated, then said, "May I call you Josephine?" The sound of her given name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Yes, Josephine then, and I'm Darius." His smile grew, transforming his face. "Whatever you were before Edgar Mercer came into your life, you still are. He might have buried it for a while, but it's still there. You just need to find it again." His words stayed with her as she finished breakfast, as she walked to the dressmaker's shop with directions from Mrs. Sullivan, as she nervously introduced herself to Mrs. Peterson, a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, who looked Josephine over with keen eyes. "Darius Vance says you need work and can sew," Mrs. Peterson said without preamble. "Yes, madam, my mother taught me. I made all my own clothes before I married." "Let's see then." She handed Josephine a piece of muslin and a needle already threaded. "Show me what you can do." Josephine's fingers trembled at first, but as she began to work, muscle memory took over. The neat, even stitches emerged from beneath her fingertips, and a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years spread through her. Mrs. Peterson examined her work with a critical eye. "Not bad. A bit rusty, but we can work with that." She named a weekly wage that seemed more than fair. "You'll start with simple mending, then move to helping with fittings once you're up to speed. Can you begin tomorrow?" "Yes, madam. Thank you, madam." Josephine fought back tears of gratitude. As she left the shop, the weight of uncertainty lifted slightly from her shoulders. She had a place to stay, a job, and the beginnings of independence. All because a cowboy had happened to walk through her door at the exact right moment. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Josephine settled into her new life. Each morning, she rose early to help Mrs. Sullivan with breakfast before walking to the dressmaker's shop, where she spent her days mending torn garments and gradually taking on more complex tasks. Her fingers grew stronger and more confident, her stitches more precise. And every few days, Darius Vance would appear, sometimes at the boarding house during breakfast, sometimes at the shop as she was finishing for the day, always with the same gentle inquiry about her well-being. "You don't need to keep checking on me," she told him one evening as he walked her back to the boarding house, the October air crisp around them. "I'm managing quite well now." "I know you are," he replied, his hands in his pockets as they strolled. "Maybe I just enjoy the company." Josephine glanced at him, surprised. "My company? Is that so hard to believe?" His green eyes caught the golden light of the setting sun. She looked away, flustered. "I'm not very good company these days. I hardly know what to talk about besides work and weather." "Then we'll talk about work and weather," he said simply. "Or we could talk about how the aspen trees turn gold this time of year, or how the first snow will come to the peaks any day now." Despite herself, Josephine smiled. "You love it here, don't you? Breckenridge." Darius nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've traveled a fair bit Texas, New Mexico, California, but the mountains always call me back. There's something about waking up to those peaks every morning that sets right with my soul. I grew up in Kansas, Josephine offered. I'd never seen mountains until I came west with Edgar after we married. She paused, then added quietly, "They frightened me at first, so tall, so imposing. But now I find them comforting, like they're standing guard." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Darius said, "I'm leading a group up to the new silver claim next week. I'll be gone for about 10 days. Josephine felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Oh, well, I'm sure you'll enjoy the journey." "It's work," he corrected with a small smile. "Enjoyment is optional, but I wanted you to know I wasn't just disappearing on you." The fact that he thought she might worry about his absence warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you for telling me." They reached the boarding house steps and Josephine turned to face him. "Be careful up in those mountains," she said impulsively. "I hear the weather can turn quickly this time of year." His eyes softened. "I will, and Josephine, if Edgar comes around while I'm gone, I'll tell Sheriff Davis immediately," she assured him. "But I haven't seen Edgar since that day." Darius looked relieved. "Good, that's good." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Josephine." "Good night, Darius." She watched him walk away, struck by how much brighter her days had become with his occasional presence in them. It wasn't romantic, she was still married after all. And the wounds from Edgar's abuse were too fresh, but his friendship had become precious to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The following Tuesday, as Josephine was helping Mrs. Peterson with a fitting for the mayor's wife, the bell above the shop door jingled. She looked up, automatically offering a welcoming smile which froze on her face when she saw who had entered. Edgar Mercer stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking thinner and more unkempt than when she'd last seen him. His eyes locked on hers, and Josephine felt the familiar fear creeping up her spine. "Mrs. Peterson," she whispered, "that's my husband." The older woman straightened, taking in the situation with a glance. "Mrs. Henderson, we're nearly done here. Would you mind waiting in the back room for just a moment? Martha will bring you some tea." She gestured to her other assistant, who quickly ushered the mayor's wife through a curtained doorway. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" Mrs. Peterson asked, positioning herself slightly in front of Josephine. Edgar ignored her, his eyes fixed on his wife. "I've come to bring Josie home." Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm not going back, Edgar. Don't be foolish, Josie. You're my wife. Your place is with me." His tone was reasonable, even gentle, but Josephine knew the rage that simmered beneath. "I think Mrs. Mercer has made herself clear, Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "Now, this is a place of business. This doesn't concern you," Edgar snapped, taking a step forward. "Josie, get your things. We're leaving." Josephine's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "No." Edgar's face darkened. "That Cowboy's filled your head with nonsense. You think you can just walk away from your wedding vows, from me. You broke those vows the first time you raised your hand to me," Josephine said, surprising herself with her steadiness. "I'm your husband. I have the right." "You have no right to hurt her," Mrs. Peterson interrupted. "Now, I suggest you leave before I send Martha for the sheriff." Edgar's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This isn't over, Josie." He jammed his hat back on his head. "When Vance isn't around to play protector, we'll settle this." The threat hung in the air even after he'd stormed out, slamming the door so hard the bell nearly flew off its hook. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her hand on Josephine's arm. Josephine nodded, though she felt anything but all right. "I should have known he wouldn't just let me go. Men like that seldom do." Mrs. Peterson's expression was grim. "But you're not alone, remember that. The sheriff should know about this visit." By the time Josephine finished work that day, word of Edgar's appearance at the dressmaker's shop had spread through town. Mrs. Sullivan met her at the door with worried eyes. "I've already spoken to Sheriff Davis," she said, ushering Josephine inside. "He's going to keep a deputy near the boarding house tonight, just in case." "I've caused so much trouble," Josephine murmured, sinking into a chair by the fire. "Nonsense. Edgar Mercer is the trouble, not you." Mrs. Sullivan pressed a cup of tea into her hands. "I only wish Darius were here. He'd know how to handle this." Josephine clutched the warm cup. "I'm glad he isn't. This isn't his responsibility." But as she lay awake that night, listening to every creak and rustle in the old house, she couldn't help wishing for the sense of security Darius's presence always brought her. The next few days passed without incident. Josephine continued her work at the shop, walked to and from the boarding house with Martha or another lodger, and tried to convince herself that Edgar had given up. On Friday, nearly a week after Edgar's visit, Josephine was sorting through a basket of mending when Mrs. Peterson approached with a letter in her hand. "This came for you," she said, her expression concerned. "The boy who delivered it said a man gave him a nickel to bring it directly to you." Josephine took the folded paper with trembling fingers. Her name was scrawled across the front in Edgar's distinctive handwriting. She opened it, dread pooling in her stomach. "Meet me at our house at sunset," it read. "Come alone, or I'll tell everyone in town how you've been carrying on with Vance while I've been working to put food on our table. Your reputation will be in shreds. Last chance, Josie." Josephine crumpled the note in her fist. "He wants me to meet him. He's threatening to spread lies about me and Darius if I don't." Mrs. Peterson's mouth set in a hard line. "You're not going. But what if he does start rumors? People would believe him. He's my husband, and Darius has been so kind. I couldn't bear for his name to be dragged through the mud because of me." "Darius Vance's reputation can withstand a few wagging tongues," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "Yours is more important right now. We're going straight to the sheriff with this." Sheriff Davis read the note with a deep frown etched into his weathered face. "This is a clear threat, Mrs. Mercer. I could arrest him for this." "And then what?" Josephine asked, wringing her hands. "He'd be even angrier when he got out." The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're probably right about that. Law's not always equipped to handle these kinds of situations." He thought for a moment. "Here's what we'll do. I'll send Deputy Wilson to keep watch on your old house. If Edgar shows up, we'll have a word with him about making threats. Meanwhile, you stay at the boarding house and don't go anywhere alone until Vance gets back." "When will that be?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "Should be tomorrow or the day after, according to the schedule he left with me." The sheriff looked at Josephine kindly. "Just hold tight a little longer, Mrs. Mercer. We'll see you through this." But as Josephine walked back to the boarding house that evening, flanked by Mrs. Peterson and Deputy Wilson, she couldn't shake the feeling that Edgar wasn't going to be deterred by a simple talking to from the sheriff. She was right. The next morning, Josephine woke to an insistent knocking on her bedroom door. Mrs. Sullivan's voice came through, high with worry. "Josephine, dear, you need to come downstairs. The sheriff is here." Heart pounding, Josephine dressed quickly and hurried down to find Sheriff Davis standing in the front parlor, his expression grave. "What's happened?" she asked, fear clutching at her throat. "There was a fire at your old house last night," he said without preamble. "Started in the kitchen, spread quickly. By the time we got the bucket line going, the place was mostly gone." Josephine sank into the nearest chair. "Edgar? Not there. My deputy watched until well after sunset, but Mercer never showed. The fire started around midnight." The sheriff looked troubled. "Thing is, Mrs. Mercer, fires don't just start themselves, especially not that late, and given that note he sent you. You think Edgar said it?" The idea that her husband would burn down their own home was shocking, yet somehow not surprising. "I can't prove it," the sheriff admitted, "but I'd bet my badge on it. The question is, why? What does he gain from burning his own house?" The answer came to Josephine in a sickening flash. "He's angry. At me, at Darius, at the whole town for taking my side." She looked up at the sheriff, sudden terror gripping her. What if he's not done? What if the house was just the beginning? Sheriff Davis's expression confirmed her fears. "That's what I'm worried about. I've got my deputies keeping an eye out for him, but Breckenridge isn't that big. If he's gone to ground, someone will spot him eventually." "What should I do?" Josephine whispered. "Stay here. Keep the doors locked. Don't go anywhere alone." The sheriff headed for the door. "I'll check back this evening. And Mrs. Mercer, try not to worry too much. We'll find him." But worry she did, all through the morning as she sat by the window in the boarding house parlor, jumping at every sound from the street outside. Mrs. Sullivan tried to distract her with conversation and chores, but the fear had settled deep in Josephine's bones. By mid-afternoon, the waiting had become unbearable. "I need to get some air," she told Mrs. Sullivan. "Just on the porch. I'll stay in sight of the house." Mrs. Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a few minutes, then, and call out if you see anything suspicious." The crisp autumn air was a relief after the stuffy parlor. Josephine sank into the porch swing, letting the gentle motion soothe her frayed nerves. The street was quiet. Most people were at work or school at this hour, and the mountains rose majestically in the distance, unchanged by the human dramas playing out beneath them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense, until she recognized the chestnut gelding and its rider. Relief flooded through her as Darius Vance dismounted in front of the boarding house, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Josephine," he called, securing his horse to the hitching post. "I just got back and heard about the fire. Are you all right?" She stood as he took the porch steps 2 at a time, his concerned gaze sweeping over her as if checking for injuries. "I'm fine. I wasn't there. Thank God for that." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Sheriff Davis filled me in on what's been happening. Edgar's note, the fire. I'm sorry I wasn't here." "It's not your responsibility," she reminded him, though her heart warmed at his concern. "Maybe not," he conceded, "but I still wish I'd been around to help." He glanced at the quiet street. "Has there been any sign of him today?" Josephine shook her head. "The sheriff has people looking, but—" She trailed off, a movement across the street catching her eye. A familiar figure stepped from between 2 buildings, and her blood ran cold. "Darius," she whispered, clutching his arm. "He's here." Darius turned, his body tensing as Edgar Mercer emerged fully onto the street. Even from this distance, Josephine could see the wild look in her husband's eyes, the determined set of his shoulders, and the glint of metal in his hand. "Get inside," Darius said quietly, pushing her toward the door. "Now, Josephine," but she couldn't move, frozen by the sight of Edgar raising a pistol, aiming directly at them. "Vance," Edgar shouted, his voice carrying across the silent street. "You stole my wife. Now I'm going to make her watch you die." Everything happened in a blur after that. Darius shoving Josephine behind him. The crack of a gunshot. Darius stumbling back against her as the bullet struck him. His own quick draw and return fire. Edgar falling to the street in a heap. And then silence, broken only by Darius's labored breathing and the distant shouts of people running toward the commotion. "Darius," Josephine cried, supporting him as he sagged against the porch railing. Blood was spreading across his left shoulder, staining his shirt crimson. "Someone help." "He's been shot," Mrs. Sullivan burst through the front door, her face pale with shock. "Get him inside. I'll send for the doctor." Between them, they managed to get Darius into the parlor and onto the sofa. Josephine pressed a clean towel to his wound, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare die," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare." Darius's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with effort. "Not planning on it," he murmured, his voice strained. "Is he? I don't know." Josephine couldn't bring herself to look outside to see whether her husband lay dead or wounded in the street. Sheriff Davis answered that question when he burst through the door moments later. "Doc's on his way," he announced, kneeling beside the sofa. "How bad is it, Vance?" "Had worse," Darius grunted, though the pallor of his face suggested otherwise. "Edgar?" Josephine asked, dreading the answer either way. "Dead," the sheriff said bluntly. "Shot clean through the heart. Vance here's still the best marksman in the county, even with a bullet in him." He looked at Josephine. "It was self-defense, Mrs. Mercer. Clear as day. Half the town saw Edgar fire first." Relief and grief warred within her, relief that the threat was over. Grief for the man Edgar might have been, for the marriage that had turned so horribly wrong. "You're a widow now," Sheriff Davis added quietly. "I'm sorry it happened this way." A widow. The word echoed in Josephine's mind as she continued to press the rapidly reddening towel against Darius's shoulder. "Free, but at such a terrible cost, Doctor." Lewis arrived in a flurry of activity, shooing everyone except Mrs. Sullivan from the room as he examined Darius's wound. Josephine paced the hallway, her hands and dress stained with Darius's blood, praying to a God she wasn't sure still listened to her. After what seemed like hours, the doctor emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The bullet went clean through," he reported. "Missed anything vital. He's lost a fair amount of blood, but with rest and care he should make a full recovery." Josephine nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see him?" Dr. Lewis nodded. "He's asking for you, but he needs rest, so keep it brief." Darius lay pale against the pillows, his shoulder bandaged, his eyes closed. For a moment, Josephine thought he was asleep, but at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes opened. "There you are," he murmured, his voice weak but steady. "Are you all right?" She gave a choked laugh. "You're asking me that, after taking a bullet." A faint smile touched his lips. "Answer the question, Josephine. I don't know what I am." She sank into a chair beside the sofa. Relieved, terrified, grateful. She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "You saved my life." "And you saved mine," he countered, "if you hadn't been pressing on that wound." He squeezed her hand weakly. "I'm sorry about Edgar." Josephine shook her head. "He made his choices. I just wish." She trailed off, unsure how to express the complicated tangle of emotions surrounding her husband's death. "I know," Darius said simply, and somehow she believed he did understand. "Doctor." Lewis insisted that Darius remain at the boarding house for at least a week, moving him to his own small cabin outside town would risk reopening the wound. Mrs. Sullivan prepared the room across from Josephine's, and together they tended to him as he began the slow process of recovery. The town buzzed with the story of the shootout. Josephine avoided going out at first, not wanting to face the whispers and stares, but when she finally ventured to the dressmaker's shop 3 days after Edgar's death, she was surprised by the reception. "There she is, Mrs. Peterson announced as Josephine entered hesitantly. The 3 customers in the shop turned, and to Josephine's shock, they all smiled warmly. "Mrs. Mercer," said Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, "we've all been so worried about you and Mr. Vance. How is he faring?" "He's improving," Josephine replied, taken aback by the genuine concern. "The doctor says he'll recover fully with time." "Thank goodness for that," another woman chimed in. "What that man did charging in with a gun in broad daylight. Mr. Vance is a hero for protecting you." Josephine stood speechless, tears threatening. She had expected judgment, condemnation for her role in the violence that had erupted on their quiet street. Instead, she found only support. Mrs. Peterson squeezed her arm gently. "Everyone knows what kind of man Edgar was, dear. And everyone knows that Darius Vance wouldn't have fired that gun if he'd had any other choice." As October gave way to November, Darius grew stronger. His color returned, and he began taking short walks with Josephine around the boarding house garden, his arm in a sling. His steps a little unsteady at first, but gaining confidence daily. They talked during those walks, really talked, in a way Josephine had never experienced with a man before. Darius told her about his childhood in Missouri, his father's early death, his mother's struggles. She shared memories of her parents' farm in Kansas, her dreams of becoming a teacher before Edgar had come courting. "You still could," Darius pointed out one crisp afternoon as snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky. "Become a teacher, I mean. You're young, Josephine. Your whole life is ahead of you." She glanced at him, suddenly shy. "And what about you? What's ahead for Darius Vance?" He looked out at the mountains, their peaks already dusted with the season's first snow. "More of the same, I suppose. Guiding, ranching when I can get work. It's a good life." "A solitary one, though." His eyes met hers, something warm and unnamed passing between them. "It has been." "Doesn't have to stay that way." Josephine's heart fluttered. "Darius, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "It's too soon. I know that. You've been through more in the past month than most people face in a lifetime. I just want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I don't deserve your patience." "You deserve that and more," he said firmly. "And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to believe that." The first genuine snowfall of winter blanketed Breckenridge in white 2 weeks later. By then, Darius had moved back to his cabin, though he still came to town almost daily to check on Josephine. His shoulder was healing well, he could use his arm again, though the doctor warned against any heavy lifting for another month. On a Saturday in early December, Darius arrived at the boarding house with an unexpected proposal. "I'm heading up to Denver next week," he told Josephine as they sat in the parlor. "There's a cattle buyer there who's looking for guides for a spring drive from Texas. The pay would be good." Josephine's heart sank at the thought of him leaving, even temporarily. "How long would you be gone?" "That's just it. If I take this job, I'd be gone for months. 3, maybe 4. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'd like you to come with me to Denver." She stared at him, startled. "To Denver? But why?" "Because I think you'd like it there. It's bigger than Breckenridge, with more opportunities. There's a teacher's college, and—" he hesitated. "And because I can't bear the thought of being away from you for that long." Josephine's pulse quickened. "Darius, people would talk." "A widow traveling with a single man. We could go with Mrs. Sullivan," he suggested quickly. "She's mentioned wanting to visit her sister in Denver. It would be completely proper." She considered it, tempted by the idea of seeing more of the world, of spending time with Darius away from the memories that haunted Breckenridge. "When would we leave?" His face lit up with hope. "Next Tuesday. We'd be back before Christmas. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Peterson about taking time away from the shop. Of course." His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Just let me know your decision as soon as you can." Mrs. Peterson, as it turned out, was enthusiastically supportive of the idea. "Denver? Oh, you must go, Josephine. And while you're there, you can visit the fabric warehouses for me. I've been wanting some of those new silks they are importing from China." With Mrs. Sullivan equally excited about the journey, the arrangements were quickly made. The stagecoach would take them to Denver in 2 days' time, with comfortable accommodations awaiting them at Mrs. Sullivan's sister's home near the center of the city. As Josephine packed her small bag, She realized how much her life had changed in just a few short months. From a prisoner in her own home to a woman embarking on an adventure with friends who cared for her well-being. From living in constant fear to feeling hopeful about the future. All because a cowboy had walked through her door at the right moment and said, "Pack your things." Denver was a revelation. Compared to Breckenridge, it was a bustling metropolis, with paved streets, gaslights, and buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories high. Josephine stared in wonder as their stagecoach rolled through the city, taking in the well-dressed crowds, the elegant shops, the sense of progress and possibility that permeated the air. Mrs. Sullivan's sister, Beatrice, was a widow who had transformed her large home into a genteel boarding house catering to business travelers and visiting families. She welcomed them warmly, showing Josephine to a lovely room overlooking a small garden, now dormant under a light dusting of snow. "Darius tells me you have an interest in teaching," Beatrice said as she helped Josephine unpack. "We have an excellent teachers' college here. My late husband was on the board." Josephine smoothed a hand over her dress, suddenly self-conscious. "It's just a dream, really." "I don't have the training." "Nonsense," Beatrice interrupted briskly. "Everyone starts somewhere. The winter term begins in January. You should speak with the headmaster while you're here." The idea took root in Josephine's mind, growing stronger as the days passed. Denver offered a freedom she hadn't experienced before. Here, she wasn't poor Mrs. Mercer or Edgar's widow. She was simply Josephine, a young woman with a future still unwritten. Darius was busy with his meetings during the days, but in the evenings he escorted Josephine and Mrs. Sullivan to dinner, to the theater, once even to a concert featuring a famous opera singer from New York. Josephine found herself laughing more, standing taller, meeting people's eyes with a confidence she thought she'd lost forever. And through it all, Darius was there, attentive but never presumptuous, his gaze warming whenever it rested on her, his hand steady at her elbow as he guided her through crowded streets. On their 5th day in Denver, Josephine visited the teachers' college. The headmaster, Professor Williams, listened patiently as she explained her background and aspirations. "Your academic history is somewhat limited," he noted, reviewing the information she'd provided, "but your eagerness to learn is evident. We could admit you on a probationary basis for the winter term with full acceptance contingent on your performance." Hope surged through Josephine. "Really? You would consider me?" The professor smiled kindly. "Education is about potential, Mrs. Mercer. I believe you have a great deal of it." She practically floated back to Beatrice's house, her mind racing with possibilities. A new path was opening before her, one that would require courage and hard work, but one that was entirely her own choice. Darius was waiting in the parlor when she returned, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "How did it go?" "They'll accept me," she said, still scarcely believing it. "On probation, but still I could start in January." He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. "Josephine, that's wonderful. I knew you could do it." She looked up at him, suddenly realizing the implications. "But you'll be in Texas, and I'll be here in Denver." His expression softened. "About that, I've been doing some thinking. The cattle drive would take me away for too long. I've decided not to take the job." "But you said the pay was good." "There are other jobs," he said simply. "Ones that won't take me 1,000 miles away from you." Josephine's heart thundered in her chest. "What are you saying, Darius?" He drew a deep breath, his green eyes serious. "I'm saying that I care for you, Josephine, more than I've ever cared for anyone. And if you decide to stay in Denver to attend the college, I'll find work here. If you want to return to Breckenridge, I'll go back with you. Whatever you choose for your future, I want to be part of it if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes. It's too soon. I'm still in mourning, and I know," he said gently. "I'm not asking for promises, just possibilities, possibilities." The word hung in the air between them, full of hope and uncertainty, and the tentative beginnings of something that might, with time and care, grow into love. "I think," Josephine said carefully, "that I would like to attend the teacher's college. And I think I would like very much if you were nearby while I did." The smile that spread across Darius's face was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. "Then that's what we'll do." The decision made, the next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Josephine secured her place at the college and arranged to rent a small room in Beatrice's boarding house. Darius found work with a freighting company that operated between Denver and the surrounding mining towns, allowing him to use his knowledge of mountain trails while keeping him based in the city. Mrs. Sullivan, though initially surprised by their decision to remain in Denver, quickly became their strongest supporter. "It makes perfect sense," she declared. "Denver has more opportunities for both of you, and Beatrice will look after Josephine as if she were her own daughter." The day before Mrs. Sullivan was due to return to Breckenridge, she took Josephine aside for a private conversation. "I've watched you these past weeks," the older woman said, her eyes kind. "You're blooming, my dear, like a flower that's finally found the sunlight it needs." Josephine smiled, knowing it was true. "I feel alive again. For so long with Edgar I was just surviving. Now I'm beginning to remember what it's like to live." "And Darius?" Mrs. Sullivan asked gently. "What are your feelings there?" A blush warmed Josephine's cheeks. "It's complicated. Sometimes I feel guilty for being happy when Edgar is dead. Sometimes I'm afraid that what I feel for Darius is just gratitude. But then—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Then there are moments when he looks at me or says something that makes me laugh, and I feel this flutter in my chest, like my heart is remembering how to beat properly again." Mrs. Sullivan patted her hand. "That's as good a beginning as any, my dear. The rest will come with time." Time was exactly what Josephine needed and what Darius gave her. Throughout the winter months, as she threw herself into her studies, and he established himself with the freighting company, their relationship developed slowly, naturally. They dined together several evenings a week, attended church on Sundays, occasionally joined Beatrice for cultural outings around the city, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, Josephine's heart began to heal. The nightmares about Edgar grew less frequent. The flinch when someone moved too quickly near her faded. The reflexive apologies for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing, those too, began to disappear. In their place grew confidence, joy, and a deepening affection for the patient, kind man who had rescued her in more ways than one. By March, when the first crocuses began pushing through the melting snow in Beatrice's garden, Josephine knew with certainty that what she felt for Darius was far more than gratitude. It was love different from anything she'd felt before, steadier and stronger, built on friendship and respect rather than the desperate infatuation that had led her to Edgar. But still, she hesitated to speak of it. The shadow of her marriage, of Edgar's violence and his death, still lingered. And though the law considered her period of mourning complete, something within her needed more time. Darius seemed to understand without being told. He never pressed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. His own feelings were clear in 100 small ways: the light in his eyes when she entered a room, the gentle touch of his hand at her elbow, the way he listened, really listened, when she spoke. Spring turned to summer. Josephine completed her probationary term at the teacher's college with high marks, earning full acceptance into the program. Darius was promoted to lead guide for the freighting company, responsible for planning routes and training new men. They celebrated both achievements with a picnic in the city park, where Darius surprised her with a small cake and a bouquet of wildflowers. "I'm proud of you," he told her as they sat on a blanket beneath a leafy oak tree. "Do you know how remarkable you are, Josephine?" She ducked her head, still unused to such praise. "I just worked hard." "No." He tipped her chin up gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You survived something that would have broken many people, and instead of just surviving, you're thriving, building a new life. That takes courage." Josephine looked at this man who had become the center of her world, at the warmth in his green eyes, the strength in his hands, the steadfastness in his character, and knew it was time. "I love you," she said simply. Darius went completely still, as though afraid any movement might shatter the moment. "Josephine, I love you," she repeated, more confidently this time. "I think I have for a long time, but I needed to be sure it wasn't just gratitude or dependence. I needed to know I could stand on my own before I chose to stand with you. And now," his voice was husky with emotion, "now I know I can be whole by myself, but I'd rather be whole with you." He reached for her then, drawing her into an embrace that felt like coming home. "I love you, Josephine. I've loved you since that first day at Mrs. Sullivan's, when you were so brave and so broken all at once. I've been trying to find the patience to wait until you were ready to hear it." She smiled against his shoulder. "I'm ready now." They were married in September, beneath the aspen trees just outside Denver as they turned to gold. Mrs. Sullivan came from Breckenridge for the ceremony, along with Mrs. Peterson and several other friends. Beatrice hosted the reception in her garden, where lanterns hung from tree branches and tables groaned with food and drink. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue silk, not white, for this was not her first marriage, but something new and hopeful nonetheless. Darius looked handsome in a new suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. "I promise to cherish you," he said, his voice carrying clearly to everyone gathered. "To respect you, to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you. To support your dreams as fervently as my own." Tears slipped down Josephine's cheeks as she responded with her own vows, promises of love, partnership, and the kind of honest communication she'd never experienced in her first marriage. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Darius kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. The applause from their friends seemed distant, unimportant compared to the look in his eyes when he finally drew back. "Mrs. Vance," he murmured, just for her ears. "At last." They honeymooned in a small cabin in the mountains, where autumn painted the world in brilliant hues of red and gold and orange. For a week, they existed in their own private universe, talking long into the night, exploring the trails around the cabin during the day, learning the contours of each other's bodies with reverent hands. On their last evening before returning to Denver, they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery light. Josephine leaned against Darius's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed. "After Edgar, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again, let alone loved." Darius pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You deserve every happiness, Josephine, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." She twisted to look up at him. "Do you ever think about that day when you walked into the house and saw what was happening?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about what might have happened if I'd been a few minutes later, or if I'd decided to wait until the next day to tell Edgar about the foreman looking for him." "Divine timing," Josephine murmured. "That's what Mrs. Sullivan calls it." Darius smiled. "Maybe she's right. All I know is that when I saw him hurting you, something in me just knew I couldn't walk away, knew you deserved better." "Pack your things," Josephine quoted softly. "Those were the first words you said to me." "Did you know then what would happen? That we would end up here?" He shook his head. "I just knew you needed help. The rest—" His arms tightened around her. "The rest was us finding our way to each other, one step at a time." When they returned to Denver, they moved into a small house near the teacher's college, a wedding gift from Darius's aunt in Missouri, who had written that she was delighted Darius had finally found a woman worthy of his heart. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm. Josephine continued her studies, excelling in her courses and beginning to assist with teaching the younger students. Darius's work with the freighting company kept him busy, but allowed him to be home most evenings and weekends. Together, they built a life filled with books and conversation, music and laughter, and a deep, abiding love that grew stronger with each passing day. In the spring of 1878, a year and a half after they'd married, Josephine graduated from the teacher's college with honors. Darius surprised her with a special dinner to celebrate, complete with champagne and a small velvet box that contained a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged as she admired the intricate engraving on its surface. Inside was a tiny portrait of the two of them, painted by a miniaturist who had recently set up shop in Denver. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, closing it carefully and letting Darius fasten it around her neck. "Thank you." "There's something else," he said, his expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I've been offered a new position. The Rocky Mountain School for Boys is looking for a wilderness guide to teach outdoor skills and lead expeditions. The pay is good and I'd be working with young men instead of freight." Josephine's face lit up. "Darius, that's perfect for you. You'd be an excellent teacher." "There's more," he continued. "They're also looking for a teacher for their primary department, younger brothers of the students who aren't old enough for the main school yet. With your new qualifications, we could both work there." The possibility was thrilling. Darius nodded. "There's just one thing, the school is in Colorado Springs. We'd have to move." Josephine considered this. Denver had been their fresh start, the place where they'd built their life together. But the idea of a new adventure, of working alongside Darius at a school, was appealing. "When would they need an answer?" "Within the week," Darius said. "I wanted to discuss it with you before making any decisions. This affects both our futures." The simple fact that he valued her opinion, that he saw their life together as a partnership of equals, still amazed Josephine sometimes. "I think we should at least visit Colorado Springs," she said. "See the school, meet the headmaster, then decide together." Darius's smile was bright enough to light the room. "I'll make the arrangements tomorrow." Colorado Springs charmed them from the moment they arrived. Smaller than Denver, but still vibrant, the town nestled at the foot of Pikes Peak, with views that took Josephine's breath away. The Rocky Mountain School for Boys occupied a sprawling campus just outside town, with modern buildings, extensive grounds, and a progressive educational philosophy that aligned perfectly with Josephine's own beliefs. The headmaster, Professor Harrison, was equally impressed with the Vances. "You both come highly recommended," he told them as he showed them around the campus. "And having a married couple who can serve as examples for our boys would be invaluable." By the time they boarded the train back to Denver, the decision was made. They would move to Colorado Springs in July, in time to prepare for the fall term. The summer passed in a flurry of packing, farewells, and preparations for their new positions. Beatrice hosted a going-away party that left Josephine teary-eyed with gratitude for the friends they'd made in Denver. Mrs. Sullivan came to help with the move, bringing news from Breckenridge and promises to visit them in Colorado Springs. Their new home was a cottage on the school grounds, small but comfortable, with a garden that Josephine immediately began planning for the next spring. Unpacking their belongings, books and dishes, clothing and keepsakes, Josephine was struck by how much they had accumulated in their time together. Not just possessions, but memories, inside jokes, shared experiences that had woven their lives inextricably together. "What are you thinking about?" Darius asked, finding her standing motionless in the middle of the parlor, a framed photograph in her hands. She looked up at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, and felt her heart swell with love. "I was thinking about how different my life is now from what it was that day in Breckenridge. How I never could have imagined this future." He crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Are you happy with how things turned out?" "Happier than I ever thought possible." She leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "Do you remember what you said to me once about how I was still everything I was before Edgar came into my life?" Darius nodded, his chin brushing against her hair. "I remember. You were right, but I'm also more than I was before, stronger, braver." She turned in his arms to face him. "And that's because of you." "No," he corrected gently. "It's because of you, Josephine. I just helped clear the path. You're the one who chose to walk it." As they settled into their new life in Colorado Springs, Josephine found that teaching came naturally to her. The young boys in her classroom responded to her gentle guidance and firm boundaries, flourishing under her care. Darius, too, excelled in his role, his patience and outdoor skills making him a favorite among the older students. In the evenings, they would share stories from their days over dinner, offering each other advice and support. On weekends, they explored the stunning landscape around Colorado Springs, hiking through forests of pine and aspen, picnicking beside clear mountain streams, discovering hidden valleys and breathtaking vistas. And at night, in the privacy of their cottage, they loved each other with a passion that had only deepened with time and trust. It was after one such night, in the quiet darkness just before dawn, that Josephine whispered the news she'd suspected for several weeks but had only confirmed with the doctor the previous day. "Darius, are you awake?" He stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist. "I am now." She took his hand, guiding it to rest on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment he went completely still, then he sat up, staring down at her in the dim light. "A baby, you're certain?" Josephine nodded, her heart racing. "Dr. Martin confirmed it yesterday. In the spring, April, he thinks." Darius's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Our baby." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious material on earth. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "Both of you." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Professor Harrison was supportive, assuring Josephine that her position would be held for her should she wish to return after the baby was born. Their cottage was modified to include a nursery, painted a cheerful yellow with white curtains that Josephine sewed herself. As her body changed, growing round with the new life within, Darius treated her with a tenderness that sometimes made her laugh. "I'm not going to break, you know," she teased one evening as he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry that was hardly heavy at all. "Humor me," he replied with a grin. "It's not every day a man gets to witness a miracle." The miracle arrived on a bright April morning in 1879, a healthy baby boy with Darius's green eyes and a tuft of dark hair that promised to be as wavy as his father's. They named him Samuel Thomas Vance, Samuel for Josephine's father, Thomas for Darius's. Holding her son in her arms with Darius beside her, his face alight with pride and love, Josephine felt a sense of completeness she had never known was possible. This was what family should be built on: love and respect, nurturing and supportive. "He's perfect," Darius whispered, gently stroking their son's tiny hand, "just like his mother." Josephine smiled up at him, exhausted but exhilarated. "I think he has your nose." "Poor kid," Darius joked, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Josephine, for our son, for our life together, for everything." She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you for saying pack your things that day in Breckenridge, for giving me the courage to leave, for showing me what love really means." As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, their family flourished. Josephine returned to teaching part-time when he was a year old, with a nursemaid to help care for him while she was in the classroom. Darius was promoted to head of the outdoor education department at the school, developing a curriculum that combined practical wilderness skills with conservation principles. In the summer of 1882, they returned to Breckenridge for a visit, bringing 3-year-old Samuel to meet old friends and see the place where his parents' story had begun. The town had changed, grown larger, more prosperous, but Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house looked exactly the same. "There they are," Mrs. Sullivan cried as their carriage pulled up, hurrying down the steps to envelop first Josephine, then Darius in enthusiastic hugs before crouching to meet Samuel at eye level. "And this handsome young man must be Samuel. My, but you look like your father." The visit was a joyful reunion. Mrs. Peterson, now retired and living with her daughter, came to dinner at the boarding house. Sheriff Davis, gray-haired but still imposing, stopped by to shake Darius's hand and marvel at how well Josephine looked. "Life's been good to you, I see," he observed with satisfaction. "Very good," Josephine agreed, watching as Darius showed Samuel how to play checkers in the parlor. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." On their last evening in Breckenridge, after Samuel had been put to bed in their room at the boarding house, Darius suggested a walk. "There's somewhere I'd like to go," he said, offering Josephine his arm. The evening was warm, the sky a deep azure dotted with the first stars of night. As they strolled through familiar streets, Josephine realized where they were heading. "The old house," she said softly as they turned onto the street where she and Edgar had lived. Darius nodded. "Is that all right?" "We don't have to." "No, it's fine," she assured him. "I'm curious to see what became of it after the fire." The house had been rebuilt different in style from the original, larger and more elegant. A family clearly lived there now. Lights glowed in the windows, and children's toys dotted the yard. Josephine stood across the street, studying the place where she had known such unhappiness. Strange how distant it all seemed now, almost as if it had happened to someone else. "Any regrets?" Darius asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not one. Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led me here to you and Samuel. How could I regret that?" He drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd come to find Edgar a few minutes later that day, or if I'd sent someone else with the message." "I believe we would have found each other anyway," Josephine said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Perhaps not in the same way, but I think our souls were meant to meet." Darius. He smiled down at her, love shining in his eyes. "Josephine Vance, have you become a romantic in your old age?" she laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "30 is hardly old. And yes, perhaps I have. Being loved properly tends to do that to a person." As they walked back toward the boarding house, arm in arm beneath the star-strewn sky, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened young wife, beaten for eating a biscuit, to a confident woman, teacher, mother, beloved wife. From believing she deserved nothing to knowing she deserved everything. All because a cowboy had walked through her door at precisely the right moment and said, "Pack your things." 5 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Josephine stood in the doorway of their Colorado Springs home, watching as Darius taught Samuel and their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, how to fly a kite in the meadow beyond their garden. Samuel ran ahead, tugging the string with determination, while little Elizabeth toddled after him, her chubby legs working hard to keep up. Darius glanced back, catching Josephine's eye, and the smile they shared held years of love and understanding. This was the life they had built together, not perfect, certainly, but filled with joy and purpose and the kind of deep, abiding love that grew stronger with each passing year. As Samuel's kite caught the wind and soared upward, Darius scooped Elizabeth into his arms, pointing up at her brother's triumph. The little girl's delighted laughter carried across the meadow, and Josephine's heart swelled with gratitude for the home they had created, for the family they had become, for the love that had saved them both, and most of all, for the courage to pack her things and step into the unknown that day in Breckenridge, the first step on the journey to everything her heart had ever wanted.